This is Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from an Expat's Russia, where we answer your questions about what it's like to live, work, and travel in Russia. Hey everyone, in this video we're going to discuss why, if you want to live in Russia, you have to learn Russian. Now, there are many different countries that you could probably go to and get by with English. Russia typically isn't one of those, but on a deeper level, we'll go into why, even if you could get by on English or another language, you wouldn't want to. Matt, can you give us some examples why that is?
Sure. So I think you touched on a great point. Any expat who's been, or any traveler even, to Russia will notice that Russians are quite friendly to foreigners. There will be, let's say not all of them, but most are eager to speak English with foreigners, and you're going to get lots of attention being a foreigner in Russia. But the fact of the matter is that when you're a traveler or an expat dealing in expat type situations, that's very, very different than everyday life. Because if you don't speak Russian and can't read Russian, you're going to encounter lots and lots of difficulties. All of the bureaucracy in Russia is in Russian only. There's no option to speak English to do anything. So yes, you can get by, you can make friends, you can make great friends speaking only English, but you're still going to struggle with the small, everyday you're going to have battles every day to try to get things done if you don't speak Russian. I have countless examples of how just speaking some Russian made it an incredible difference in a certain situation. Before we kind of got on here, I remember in the very beginning, I was in Moscow and I was going to these language exchanges or expat meetups, and I was able to speak a little bit of Russian. I didn't speak as well as I do now, but I remember specifically a few times I would introduce myself, people were speaking English, and then Russians always, like to ask, do you speak Russian? And I would say yes, and then, I'd be standing with another American, and the American would also say yes, and he would, flex his language chops and speak 10, 20 words in Russian, and they'd giggle and think it was funny, and then I'd be able to have a conversation. Maybe it was basic at the time, but I was able to have a conversation in Russian, and everybody in the group was interested in me. And so you'll encounter that actually even with bureaucracy in Russia. If you go and they ask you for your passport in the beginning, you show it, and they're like, ooh, American. They might make some joke trying to say something in English, and then you start speaking Russian to them, and it's completely different. We mentioned in our video about driving in Russia, that's probably the only instance where I would say you should never admit to speaking Russian if you get pulled over, right? But any other situation in Russia with bureaucracy, I think you can get around a lot of problems by just speaking Russian and being friendly to Russians.
I think it comes down to, for me, so we get that question a lot, right? Can I just live in Russia without speaking Russian? And I would say you can, but you're not going to have an enjoyable experience, just like you said, and you wouldn't want to.
No. I think you should be straight up and say, it's possible to have a great experience, but you're going to have struggles.
But you're going to be in this,
expat bubble.
Very narrow, you won't be able to have the full Russian experience, which is one of the points that we want to make, is that I think in some countries, even if you do speak the language, there's a barrier between cultures. And yes,
Absolutely.
Russian is a very different culture, but Russians in general are very open. So when you do speak their language, that's the biggest barrier to actually getting into, Russian culture and having Russian friends. And after that, it's very easy to kind of, I wouldn't say assimilate, but Russians will invite you over, and you can have very deep, good relationships, friendships. Whereas in some countries, the foreigner or the immigrants, even after you learn the language, I wouldn't say it's the same case.
Right. Well, I think a great example, I watch a couple of YouTubers who used to live in China, now they live in the US. It's an American guy and a South African guy. And one of the things that they always talk about, and this was kind of surprising to me because based on my expat experience in Russia, it's very different, but they always talked about, even though they spoke fluent Chinese, even though they had Chinese wives, even though they had, dual citizen Chinese children, they were never accepted in even the most remote way into the culture, right? They're always just like the foreigner. Everywhere they went, everything they did, they were just the foreigner. To be honest, after I started speaking a good amount of Russian, I never got that people thought of me as like a second-class citizen in Russia, or that, I wasn't part of the society.
Right. The example that I always think of why you should learn Russian when you go to Russia is, imagine you're maybe late for something, or you're kind of get into trouble, right? And you come, and if you can explain, you have a good reason why you did something, incorrect, or you're late or whatever, the reason will matter to get sympathy, right? So the same way with Russian, if you're able to explain, even in a simple way, like what you need at the store, or in the train, or wherever you are, if you're able to kind of open up that channel of communication,
right?
Typically the other person, the Russian side, will go out of their way to kind of help you with whatever you're struggling with, right? If there's no communication at all, it's just like this wall, and they can't do anything, right? You can't understand Russian, they can't understand English. So just a small amount of Russian even starts to open that up. One example I can think of, a vivid example, is my brother and I were traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railway from Moscow to Irkutsk, and there was a group of Germans, and then another, I don't think it was Chinese, but some Asian country, and they didn't speak a word of Russian. And the conductor lady, who she's responsible for that train car for several days, she was able to tell me all these stories about her son going to the US, and she was we were given preferential treatment, not because I was doing anything special, but I could understand her. That was the only difference.
Right.
And then these Germans were asking about why do Russians do this or that, and it was so clear to me why, because I had had experience with Russians. I could understand them, and I was explaining. I felt like I was explaining basic Russian culture or manners to just how the behavior to these Germans, and they're like, oh, that makes sense. And to me it was funny, because they were in Russia for a week, and they wouldn't have, not knowing Russian, they can't, they see everything, but there's so much more to it, right?
For me, I honestly believe that a language is sort of the window into a culture, right? Like, you can't even begin to understand what Russian culture is like if you don't speak Russian. I would say the same about people who, don't speak English that well. You cannot even begin to understand. I've heard lots of Russians have misconceptions about America too, right? It's not just Americans have misconceptions about Russia. And a lot of these misconceptions come from the fact that they don't actually understand what's going on in a given situation. And if you don't speak Russian, it's literally impossible. And if you don't speak Russian at a, intermediate to advanced level, then, you can't catch any of these cultural cues and little things that I think really help understand, the way people are in a given culture. And for me in Russia, on one hand, this is kind of a funny observation I made only to myself, is that in Russia, the more Russian you understand, the less interesting and adventurous Russia becomes. I don't know if you also had this. But the more I understood of what was going on around me, the less crazy it seemed, and the less chaotic and less adventurous it was. Because you begin to see it as if it's...
I understand the point where, you start understanding more, and you're like, well, okay, now it doesn't seem so crazy, because you can start to see why Russians may behave in a certain way.
Right. Exactly. So
I was going to say one real quick, one kind of night and day example that I thought of is, so for a long time I was, in the teaching English business in Moscow, and I saw many teachers come through, and there were, a number of them had a good foundation of Russian, and quite a few, I would say the majority, didn't speak much Russian at all. But of those, several of them would, while they were in Russia, they were learning Russian. And the ones who, the foreign teachers who, consistently, they kind of came to work and see Russia and leave, they didn't have their experience from their perspective, they would say that it was great, most of them. But I could see between the ones who spoke Russian and the ones who kind of just did the experience and didn't really dive into Russian, the difference was night and day. And the ones who spoke really had Russian friends. They would go out and meet just even the cultural events that they could go to, right? And understand, a play in Russian, or obviously that's a high level, but the point is that they could go to some way more events. They could interact with the locals, whereas the teachers who hung out only with expats or people who knew English, they were missing out on a lot of things.
Right. Well, I think so. I made an observation actually, also in Russia. I tried to sort of correlate level of Russian knowledge to enjoyment of Russia. But I also met people who had been in Russia for 25 years and couldn't say anything besides please and thank you in Russia. I mean, to me, that was honestly almost offensive. Russians never seem to see it that way because those people usually quite enjoy their time in Russia. But it's really, but if you got talking to those people, they would kind of tell you about the daily struggles that they have. They still can't go to the store and get sliced salami. Like, how are you going to tell the woman you want sliced salami? I mean, it seems like something trivial, right? But
can't get a haircut because you have to explain.
How do you tell them? Yeah. Or, well, no, you can. Come on. You can go to one of those nice salons in the center of Moscow and pay, London prices. I mean, the option's there.
Right.
But you can't go and get your hair cut for $3 like every other Russian does. So, it's really I personally cannot even imagine what it would be like living in Russia without speaking Russian. I can't. It would be incredibly crazy. I get frustrated on trips. I found, like we go to Vietnam or to Thailand, and to be honest, they speak English quite well, at least in the tourist areas. But then, I wanted to try to experience local culture. And when you do that, it's lots of pointing to this or that or whatever. And I couldn't imagine doing that in Russia. Couldn't imagine.
Right.
But I want to say one last thing here before we kind of...
Go ahead.
I
was just going to say to that point that you made, when you go to those countries, right, they have tourists coming through all the time, so they know basic stuff. But Russia isn't quite a tourist country, although Moscow and St. Petersburg they're trying to get their numbers of tourists up. But you can't just stop somebody, on every street corner and chit chat and ask for directions or whatever. They're going to be like, pointing the same thing.
Right. Although I will say Russians would try to help you even if they spoke no English at all.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to kind of say at the end there, I want to kind of wrap it up with, if you're looking for a job in Russia or you want to settle in Russia long term, I mean, you have to speak Russian. There's no way about it. If you want to have a good job these days, outside of being an English teacher, there's not much you can do in Russia. I mean, you have to have a skill, but you also have to combine that with speaking Russian. Because how are you going to communicate and understand colleagues and get along in the workplace? So it's really an interesting dynamic at play in Russia.
So we're talking about, if you want to live in Russia, you have to learn Russian, or you said you have to speak Russian. There are a number of very happy foreigners living in Russia who don't speak Russian. And when we're talking about speak Russian, we mean that you're constantly learning the language and not just, ignoring it.
Right. So those are our ideas about why you need to know Russian to live in Russia. If you have any other thoughts on whether or not it's required to speak Russian in Russia, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear others' experience as well. We'll see you in another video.